We're on page 197, reading about Joseph, just outside Havana Harbor, 1939. 19 days from home. Joseph wished he was invisible. Once the rest of the passengers discovered who had jumped overboard yesterday, everyone stopped to tell him how sorry they were, how everything would be all right. But how could it be all right? How could it ever be all right? Joseph stood at the rail on A deck where his father had jumped. Down below, the sea was no longer empty. It was dotted with little motorboats and rowboats. Some carried reporters shouting up questions and trying to get pictures of the ship. Other boats offered up bunches of fresh bananas and bags of coconuts and oranges. Passengers on C deck tossed money down, and the fruit was passed up the ladder by the Cuban policeman guarding the top at the bottom. Lately, though, the boats were full of relatives of people on board, mostly men. They had come ahead of Cuba to get jobs and find places for their families to live. One man brought the same little white dog every day and held it up for his wife to wave to. The boats with relatives came close enough for their families to yell back and forth a little, but they couldn't get any closer. Thanks to Joseph's father, a handful of Cuban police boats now surrounded the St. Louis. They kept their rescue ships at a distance and watched for anyone else who tried to jump to freedom or death. At night, the Cuban police boat swept the hull with searchlights, and the St. Louis crew members on the captain's order patrolled the decks on suicide watch. "Eveline, there he is! There's Papa!" Renata cried. She stood a few paces away from Joseph down the rail, trying to point out where the little rowboats to her sister. "Where? I don't see him!" Eveline whined. Joseph was more interested in the small police boat that had navigated its way through the flotilla and was pulling up to the St. Louis. Anytime they had a visitor now, it was because of conversation, and soon word spread throughout the ship and the boat had brought the Cuban policeman who had saved Joseph's father. Joseph ran down to fetch his mother and sister, and together they hurried to the social hall, where a group of passengers and crew gathered to give the Cuban policeman a hero's welcome. They parted for the policeman, cheering and slapping him on the back and shaking hands with him as he went. It was the first time he had been back to the ship since jumping overboard to save Joseph's father, and Joseph and his family strained to get a good look at him over the heads of other passengers. Joseph's mother cried and put her hand to her mouth, and Joseph felt the surge of affection for the policeman. This was the man who had saved his father's life. The policeman seemed genuinely flattered and surprised by all the attention. He was a short, stocky man with olive skin, a wide face and thick mustache. He wore blue pants, a gray shirt, and on the shoulders a matching gray beret. Around his waist was a leather belt with a nightstick and holster for hanging from it. His name, they were told, was Mariano Padron. Captain Schroeder arrived to thank Officer Padron on behalf of the passengers and crew. Joseph felt a ripple of tension spread throughout the room. Joseph had seen the captain less and less as the hot days of waiting the anchor dragged on, and he wasn't the only passenger who had noticed. But they were there to celebrate. Officer Padron, not badger the captain about why they were still on the ship. The mood became happy again when the policeman was presented with a gift of 150 Rischmarks that had been collected from grateful passengers. Officer Padron was stunned, and so was Joseph. 150 Rischmarks was a lot of money, especially for people who might need that money later to pay for visas and entrance fees. Officer Padron tried to refuse the money, but the passengers wouldn't hear of it. "I was just doing my job," Officer Padron told the audience through a translator, "but I will never forget this. I will never forget any of you. Thank you." The passengers applauded again, and while many of them turned their attention to the captain to ask him for a status report, Joseph and his mother and sister pushed forward to talk to the policeman. Officer Padron's eyes lit up at the sight of Joseph's mother. He said something in Spanish, and the passenger who had spoken for him in front of the crowd smiled and translated his words. "Senora, your father was a thief?" Joseph's mother frowned. "A thief? My father? No, I don't understand." "Your father, he must be a thief," Officer Padron said through the translator, "because he stole the stars from the sky and put them in Senora's eyes." Joseph finally understood. It was some kind of compliment of how pretty she was. His mother smiled politely but impatiently. "Officer Padron, what about my husband?" she asked. "Is he all right? They won't let me go ashore and see him." The policeman shook off his hat. "I am so sorry, so very sorry. Senor Landau, yes? Your husband is alive," he said through the interpreter. "He is in the hospital. He has been—" Officer Padron was saying something more, but the translator frowned. It was beyond his limited Spanish. Officer Padron could see his confusion, and he pantomimed what he thought and turned his wrists upside down, closing his eyes, lolling his head back like he was asleep. "Sedated," Mama said. There was a pain in her voice. Joseph knew she blamed herself. The only reason her husband was gone was because she had been sedated and unable to stop him. Officer Padron nodded. "It is not good," he said through the interpreter, "but he will live." Joseph's mother took both of the policeman's hands in her own and kissed them. Thank you, Officer Padron, she spoke in German, but the policeman seemed to understand. He blushed and nodded. Then he spied Ruthie half hidden behind her mother's skirt and knelt down to her. He put his policeman's beret on her head and said something in Spanish, and she smiled. He says, "You're the policewoman now," the translator said. "He will be the criminal. You must catch him." Officer Padron led Ruthie on a merry chase around the room, Ruthie squealing. Joseph's mother laughed and threw a sob. It was the first time Joseph had heard her laugh or seen her smile in months. Officer Padron let Ruthie catch him, and he plucked the hat off Ruthie's head and put it on Joseph's head, speaking in Spanish again. "He says it's your turn," the translator says. "Oh, no," Joseph said. He waved the hand to make sure the policeman understood. He wasn't in the mood for fun and games, and besides, he was too old for that kind of thing. Officer Padron tapped Joseph's chest with the back of his hand, urging him to play. "He says he is the passenger," the translator said. Officer Padron raised himself in a mock anger and spoke in Spanish. "You, senor policeman," the translator said. "When will we leave the ship?" The happy mood suddenly disappeared. Joseph and his family and the translator looked at each other awkwardly. Officer Padron had only meant to mimic what everyone asked him all the time, but the question made Joseph sag. It felt like they were never getting off this ship. Officer Padron realized his mistake immediately and looked anguished, having brought it up. He nodded in sympathy. Then, in unison, he and Joseph spoke the answer all the Cuban guards always gave. Manana. Isabel, page 203, somewhere between the Bahamas and Florida, 1994. 5 days from home. Isabel slipped over the side of the boat into the sea and sighed. The water was warm, but it felt much cooler than being in the boat. The sun was just setting on the western horizon, turning the world into a sepia-toned photograph, but it still had to be close to 100 degrees outside. If it wouldn't have swamped their boat and drowned them all for good, Isabel would have prayed for the rain to break the muggy heat. Isabel's father had rigged up a makeshift sunshade out of his shirt for the mother, and she seemed to be better now. The aspirin had kept Mommy's fever down, and though she was still exhausted and near to bursting with Isabel's baby brother, she seemed at peace somehow, hot, but at peace. If the rest of them wanted relief, they had to wait for their turn in the water. Again, Isabel thought about their journey as a song. If the riots and trading for gasoline were the first verse, and the tanker in the storm the second verse, this part of their trip, the long, standard day and the half they'd been traveling from the Bahamas to Florida, this was the bridge. The third verse was something from others. The verse was death by slow measures. This was the down-tempo lull before the coming excitement of the climactic last verse in coda. This was limbo. They could do nothing but wait. The last silver of sun finally disappeared below the waves, and Louis cut the engine. The world went silent, but for the soft lapping of water against the hull and the creak of their disintegrating boat. "That's it," Louis said. "With the sun down, we won't be able to navigate as well." "Can't we use the stars?" Isabel asked. She remembered reading that the sailors had used the stars to navigate for centuries. "Which ones?" Louis asked. None of them knew. Amara lifted one of those gasoline jugs and swished it around what little there was left. "Saves us gas anyway," she said. "The thing's been eating it up. We'll be lucky to have enough to get to shore when we see land." "When will we get there?" Ivan asked. He was bobbing in the water just ahead of Isabel, hanging onto the hull like she was. "Tomorrow, hopefully," Senor Castillo said from inside the boat. It was the same he'd been sent yesterday and the day before that. "Manana," Isabel's father whispered. He was treading water on the other side of the boat with Senora Castillo, his head just visible over the sea. He'd been whispering that word on and off since yesterday and still shaken up somehow. Isabel didn't know why. "We'll see the lights of Miami sometime tomorrow, and we'll head straight for it," Mommy said. She shifted and winced uncomfortably. "What is it? Are you all right?" Poppy asked. Isabel Mothers put her hand on her belly. "I think it's begun." "What's begun?" Poppy asked, and his eyes went wide. "You mean the baby's coming? Here? Now?" Everyone in the boat perked up, and Isabel and Ivan pulled themselves up on the side of the boat to see. Isabel was a jumble of emotions. She was excited to see her brother after waiting so long, but suddenly she was also afraid of her mother to have a baby here in this fragile raft in the middle of the ocean, and worried, too, for the first time about how her baby brother would change her fragile family. "Yes, I think I've gone into labor," her mother said. "But no, I'm not having the baby here and now. The contractions are just starting. It took Isabel another 10 hours to come after my contractions began, remember?" Isabel had never heard her mother talk about her birth before, and she was both curious and a little weirded at the same time. "What are you going to name him?" Ivan asked. Mommy and Poppy looked at each other. "We haven't decided yet," she said. "Well, I have some good ideas if you want some," Ivan said. We're not naming him after industrial players, Isabel told him, and Ivan stuck his tongue out at her. They were all quiet for time, and Isabel watched as the golden horizon shifted from orange to purple to deep blue. Would her baby brother be born at sea or in the United States? Would it be the end of the song really to be a new life in Miami? Or would it end in tragedy for all of them, adrift, out of gas and dying of thirst in the great saltwater desert of the Atlantic? Hey, we never named our boat, Ivan said. Everyone moaned and laughed. What? Ivan said, smiling. Every good boat needs a name. I think we can all agree this isn't a good boat, Senor Castillo said. But it's the boat that's taking us to the States, to freedom, Ivan said. It deserves a name. How about Fidel? Louis joked, kicking up a splash on Castro's face at the bottom of the boat. No, 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 Poppy said. Elote Falante, the floating coffin. Isabel winced at the name. It wasn't funny. Not with her mother about to have a baby on board. Too close, Senora agreed. How about mi piro, he suggested. It was slang for, I'm out of here, in Cuba. Ciao, Pesaco, Mama said, and everyone laughed. It literally meant, goodbye, fish. But everyone in Cuba said it to each other to say goodbye. The St. Louis, Isabel's grandfather said softly. Everyone was quiet for a moment, trying to figure out the joke, but no one understood. How about El Camilo, Louis said. The camel was what they called the ugly humpbacked buses pulled around the tractors in Havana. No, no, I've got it, Amaro cried. El Batero. It was perfect, because it was the slang word for the taxis in Havana, but it actually meant the boatman. All adults laughed and clapped. No, no, Ivan said, frustrated. It needs a cool-sounding name, like the... Ivan jumped in the water, and his eyes went wide. What the... Isabel asked. Then she jumped too as something hard and leathery bumped her leg. Shark! Screamed Isabel's grandfather from the other side. Shark! The water around Ivan became a dark red cloud, and Isabel screamed. Something bumped into her leg again, and Isabel screamed and climbed into the boat, arms and legs shaking, panic thundering in her chest. Her father grabbed around her middle like they had fell back and tumble inside the boat. Beside them, Amara and Mommy helped pull Senora Castillo in the boat. As Lito pushed her up from the water from behind, Isabel and her father scrabbed to their knees and pulled grandfather in behind her. On the other side of the boat, Louis and Senor Castillo cried out Ivan's name as they hauled the limp body over the side. Ivan's right leg was a bloody mess. There were small bites all over it, as though a gang of sharks had attacked all at once. Red, raw, gaping wounds exposed the muscle underneath the skin. Isabel fell back against the side of the boat in horror. She'd never seen anything so awful. She felt like she was going to throw up. Senora Castillo wailed. Ivan was so shocked he didn't even cry out, didn't speak. His eyes had glazed look to them, and his mouth hung open. One of the gashes up near his thigh was pumping blood out like a garden hose, and Isabel watched as Ivan's face grew pale. She couldn't speak. A tourniquet, Lito cried. We have to get something around his leg to stop the bleeding. Isabel's father yanked off his belt, and Lito tried as high around Ivan's leg as he could, but the blood still flowed, coloring the water all around them in the boat a dark, sickening red. No, no, Senor Castillo cried as life went out of Ivan's eyes. Isabel wanted to scream too, but she was frozen. There was nothing she could do. There was nothing any of them could do. Ivan was dead. Louis yelled in rage and pulled his police pistol from its holster. Bang! 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 He fired once, twice, 3 times at the fin that circled the boat. No! Lito said, grabbing Louise's hands before he could shoot again. You'll just bring more sharks with the blood in the water! Too late. Another fin appeared, and another, and soon the nameless little boat was surrounded. They were trapped in their own sinking prison.